Mossdale Cave Incident. It was June 24, 1967, and 10 cavers were about to enter Mossdale Cavern to help clear some of the deeper passages and map them out. The two leaders of the group had already explored this cave before, which reassured everyone else. This particular cavern was known for its tight spaces and the very few areas where a person could fully stand. After a few hours inside, 4 of the cavers realized how difficult the cave actually was and decided to return to the surface. They noticed a cloudy sky, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The remaining cavers continued their descent until they reached the far marathon passage, which measured only 18 inches by 12 inches, with a small stream of water flowing along the bottom. Everything seemed to be going well, and the group on the surface soon noticed that it had started raining, so they took cover. Initially, the rain did not seem concerning, but the cavers inside began to notice rising water levels. When the water became alarmingly high, they decided to end the day's work and head back, even though they were still 3 hours from the entrance. Meanwhile, the surface group spotted something terrifying. A lake of water had formed around the cave's entrance. The cavers inside had no idea how much water was about to flood the cave. The surface group ran to get help, while the cavers frantically tried to reach higher chambers. However, the water continued to rise, pressing toward their faces. Rescuers and hundreds of volunteers worked tirelessly, pumping water out of the cave and pumping oxygen inside, hoping that the cavers had found a safe chamber. Unfortunately, every one of the cavers drowned. Shaft Sinkhole Tragedy. It was May 28, 1973, and a group of 9 diving experts had planned a dive at Mount Gambier's Shaft Sinkhole. This sinkhole had a unique feature. There was only a tiny opening leading to a cave with a lake 20 feet below. From this opening, a beam of light went down into the cave and onto the lake, which was extremely helpful for the divers' orientation. This beam was visible throughout most of the cave, unless divers ventured too deep into one of the 2 side branches. Everyone initially agreed that they would stay within a 200-foot maximum depth range so they could remain in the main chamber and still see the guiding light. This was their only plan. On the second day, however, 4 divers planned to go to the western section of the cave, aiming for a depth of 250 feet, which would have been a new record. This was deeper than initially intended and posed a significant risk because, in 1973, divers were still using regular air cylinders rather than mixed gas tanks. For this reason, they had to be more cautious as they went downwards, because nitrogen narcosis might have settled in. As they went down, the increasing pressure would have pushed the nitrogen into the bloodstream, producing a state of consciousness that is similar to when people are drunk. Keep in mind that these divers were not very experienced in cave diving. They were more accustomed to standard open water scuba diving. This added even more risk to their plan. They started going downwards into the western section of the cave, and one experienced diver noticed that nitrogen narcosis was kicking in, so he immediately went back out. Several of them followed him and went back to the surface as well, but 4 of them kept going, determined to set the record and get a quick look before resurfacing. After a minute or so, the group at the surface became concerned, realizing the 4 divers would soon exhaust their air supply. A few returned to the cave to find them, and they discovered a flashlight and a camera on the bottom, but no trace of the divers. There was a problem that we haven't yet mentioned: silt. The movements of the 4 divers stirred up the long settled silt into a sand cloud that would take a lot of time to settle back. This reduced visibility to less than an arm's length, removing any hope for orientation for the underwater divers. Without being able to see anything, oxygen running dangerously low, and nitrogen narcosis kicking in, the 4 divers drowned. Jacob's Well Tragedy. It's November 23, 1983, and 2 students from Texas State University, named Richard and Clark, are about to enter Jacob's Well, an underwater hole that leads to an underwater cave. This hole seems relatively shallow, around 25 feet, and many people try to touch the bottom and then come up. However, this is just a deceiving appearance because it actually leads to another underwater cave with 3 chambers. The first 2 are relatively open and easy to get through, but the third one has a really small squeeze to get into it. If you manage to squeeze through, you'll enter a room that is 10 feet tall, and you'll see a really small hole at the farthest edge, too small to pass through. This small tunnel was just 2 feet in diameter, and 2 years prior, 2 people died in it because after they managed to get through, a rock slide filled with gravel blocked them inside. Now, getting back to our 2 students, they were fairly experienced in normal diving, but not in cave diving, and they were trying to get their instructor certification in open water diving. Their instructor, Don, was an incredibly skilled and experienced diver, and he was the one who removed the 2 bodies we just talked about. He used to constantly warn everybody to stay away from Jacob's Well since it's deadly, and he even tried to cover up the small hole that leads to the 4th chamber with some cement. But other divers reopened it and left a message that said, "You can't keep us out." Don himself almost died in Jacob's Well. When he tried to enter the 4th chamber, a gravel slide trapped him in the tunnel. He almost resigned himself to death. His tank was empty, and he had swallowed some water when his survival instinct kicked in, and he started rapidly moving until he cleared enough gravel to escape. When he did, he saw his diving colleague extending a regulator for him to breathe. As he started resurfacing, the air inside inside his body expanded until he reached almost 4 times his normal body size. By the time he broke the surface, he was screaming in pain. His belly was huge because his stomach had completely ruptured. These stories caught the attention of Richard and Clark, who wanted to take a look for themselves, even though they didn't really know much about cave diving. On November 23, 1983, they went into Jacob's well and reached the 3rd chamber, where the small hole was located. Richard removed his tank to get through the hole and started going in while holding his tank. When Clark removed his own oxygen tank and tried to get in, he saw Richard's face and noticed Richard didn't have the tank with him anymore and was suffocating. Clark quickly reached for the regulator and gave it to him, letting him breathe again. They started passing the regulator back and forth as they made their way out, and somehow they managed to get through the tight squeeze of the 3rd chamber. They then began making their way toward the exit until a terrifying sound caught their attention, a clank from their oxygen tank. Not only did this mean they'd hit a wall with the tank, so they were going the wrong direction, but it also meant the tank was almost empty. They realized they'd run into the false chimney in the 1st chamber, a tunnel that looks like it leads to the surface, but is actually a dead end. Clark managed to swim back to the surface and gasped for air after covering an incredible 75 feet in a single breath. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for Richard, who remained behind and drowned. When Clark called the police for assistance, Don the instructor himself showed up and was stunned to see his students there. Gollum's Cave. It's August 18, 2005, and a group of 5 friends decided to venture into the Gollum Cave, also called the Cave of Death because of how dangerous it was. They reached the entrance at 3 a.m., and one of the friends decided to wait for the others outside. They encountered their first problem when actually trying to get in, as they had to crawl through a small pool of water. After that, there was a fork going left and right, and they chose left, which led them to another small pool of water. This seemingly innocent pool, however, actually led to another section of the cave through an underwater tunnel. The tunnel itself was really small, just 3 to 4 feet in diameter, and to get through it, you had to be completely submerged. This meant only one person at a time could go in, and they had to swim about 15 feet. One by one, they started plunging into the pool of water to reach the other side of the cave, and once they made it, they discovered a section with about 3 feet of airspace. From the perspective of the friend who stayed outside, there was no sound or light coming from inside the cave, and after a while he started to get worried. He went into the cave himself, but heard no noises and saw no lights. Not sure what to do, he first called some friends who had experience with caving, and then called the police. He couldn't have imagined what was happening inside. The 4 friends who went in probably realized that the 3 feet of airspace they'd reached had bad air, which is a term cavers use for air that doesn't have the normal balance of gases, meaning there's more carbon dioxide and less oxygen. This reduces your ability to think, move, and breathe properly, making the return swim through that narrow tunnel super risky. They tried to get back out one at a time, but the first person who went underwater was unable to find the exit hole before running out of breath. That happened because the increased carbon dioxide messed with her ability to hold her breath and think clearly. After 30 to 60 seconds, the second person went in and found the first one, and so on, until all of them got stuck in the tunnel. The police arrived and tried to pump in oxygen and pump out water, while family and friends waited anxiously outside the cave. Unfortunately, it was all in vain. The bodies were later recovered, and the cave was eventually closed off with cement. Sterkfontein Cave Incident. It was September 29, 1984. A cave explorer named Nuno Gomes was exploring unmapped sections of the Sterkfontein Cave in South Africa. He was accompanied by his 2 friends, Peter Verhulsel and Malcolm, and together they planned to lay a guideline from the entrance to the farthest point of the wet cave area known as Milner Hall. The plan was for Nuno to go in and place the guideline, while Peter and Malcolm waited outside, assisting him from the surface. Nuno plunged into the water and successfully laid the line, covering a distance of 396 feet from the entrance to the end. Happy because of the success, the 3 decided to go back in and follow the new guideline. Once they reached the air pocket at the end, they were satisfied that they had successfully mapped this cave section, so they turned around and began to head out, following the line. As Nuno led the group, he suddenly felt Malcolm touch him. Malcolm was signaling that Peter was no longer behind them. Nuno went back to see where Peter had gone and noticed that he had entered a side tunnel. Nuno tapped Peter to get his attention and signaled him to return to the guideline and exit the cave. As they headed back, however, Peter disappeared again. This time, Nuno and Malcolm assumed he had taken the other exit, avoiding the tight squeeze they themselves used, so they did not go back to look for him. When Nuno and Malcolm surfaced and realized Peter was not there and still hadn't come out after a while, they submerged once more to look for him. They searched along the guideline and even in the side tunnels, but there was no sign of him. After 4 long hours, they ran out of air tanks, and the stirred-up silt reduced visibility to almost nothing. Finally, late that afternoon, they exited the cave and called for help. The fire brigade arrived, but lacking cave diving expertise, had to wait for the police police divers to continue the search in the evening. The silt was so stirred up that visibility was heavily impaired. The police called off the search for the night, convinced they would now be searching for a body rather than a survivor. What no one realized was that Peter was not dead at all. He had been sidetracked by a secondary tunnel, and the cave's complex 3D structure, combined with the lack of a guideline, the stirred-up silt, and the darkness, made it nearly impossible for him to orient himself. After trying many possible paths, Peter found a small room and decided to wait there for rescuers. He shone his light into the water in hopes of signaling his friends, but when no one came for a long time, he switched it off to conserve the little battery life remaining. He tried making noise by banging his tank on the rocks, but to no avail. Eventually, he became exhausted, fell asleep, and lost track of time. After that first night of searching, the police closed off the cave so no one else could enter. Unfortunately, the silt took a long time to settle, so visibility remained poor. Convinced Peter had not survived, the police decided to wait a full week before resuming the search. On October 6th, 7 days after Peter's disappearance, they returned but found no sign of him. Another week passed before they tried again, but he was nowhere to be seen. Meanwhile, Peter was still alive. He had spent 14 days in complete darkness, starving and having lost much of his weight. Hoping for a way out, he decided to follow a passage leading from the small room where he had sheltered. After traveling 120 feet away from the water, he discovered it was only a dead end, so he returned to his spot near the water to wait once more for rescuers. The police continued weekend searches for 6 weeks, but they never found him and finally called off the search with no result. At that point, they reopened the dry sections of the cave, but kept the water section closed. Volunteers then began looking for a connection between the dry and wet cave systems, and Nuno joined them. His contributions were crucial. He was the one who discovered the connection where they could enter the wet section of the cave. It was there that they found a set of footprints leading to a dead end, and soon after, Peter's body. Beside his body was a message that read, "I love you, Cheryl and Ma." It was later discovered that one diver had come really close to finding him, as he entered an opening that was just 100 feet away from Peter's location. The autopsy revealed that he died of starvation after 3 weeks in the cave. Although we may criticize Peter's decision to explore on his own, we should also respect the fact that he fought to survive until the very end. Crooked Swamp Incident. It was March 27, 1982, and Donald Weltner, along with his 2 sons Christopher and Roger, were about to lead a group of 12 Boy Scouts on a day of cave exploration. This wasn't Donald's first time caving, and even though the passages in the Crooked Swamp cave system were notoriously narrow, he wasn't too concerned. Donald was bigger than the other participants, so if he could get through, the rest of the group could too. At 2 o'clock, they entered the cave through its 16 by 28-inch entrance and stopped in a room inside. Donald was on the eastern side and noticed several smaller tunnels leading from the room. However, because they weren't sure which passages would be too narrow, Donald decided to check one. It involved a tight squeeze but appeared to open to another section, so he tried to push through. The squeeze measured 18 by 20 inches, so tight that he couldn't move his arms backward or lift his head to see ahead. He was followed by his sons, and while moving forward thanks to the mud, making the terrain slippery, he reported back to them what was happening. Everything seemed normal until something unexpected occurred. As he pulled himself along, he realized the ground below him was disappearing. Donald slipped down into a tight crevice, and the slick mud prevented him from stopping his slide. His hands were trapped, leaving him no leverage to pull himself up. Making matters worse, the path angled about 30 degrees, so he had to fight against gravity. The crevice was just 5 inches wide, and the slippery mud caused his body to settle more and more. He told his sons to pull on his feet, but after several failed attempts, he told them to get the other adult in the cave, Jim. After a while, Jim also realized they wouldn't be able to free Donald on their own. Donald explained that some rocks had loosened when he slid and were now wedging against his body. Each time they tried to pull him backward, the loose rocks would slide forward and block the passage. Jim exited the cave to call for help. Cave rescue specialists and the police arrived, and because only one person could squeeze into that narrow space at a time, they tried using ropes to free Donald. This didn't work either, so they brought in tools to try breaking some of the rocks. However, given how tight the space was, hours of work led to only small breakthroughs, and Donald's situation grew worse. He was thirsty, hungry, and in a very cold environment, so hypothermia was a major concern. The cavers considered entering from the other side to give Donald food and water, but they found that the passage leading to where he laid was extremely narrow. Only 2 very small cavers, sisters Lynn and Nancy Taylor, were able to fit, but even then, they couldn't reach Donald's head. This meant there was no way of delivering supplies, so rescuers had to act quickly. They decided to dig from above ground, down to where Donald was stuck. stuck. The process lasted all day Sunday, getting them close to the required depth. Unfortunately, though, they were about 12 feet away from Donald's position, so they needed to dig laterally. Meanwhile, Donald began giving only grunting responses, which indicated he was likely suffering from hypothermia. On Monday morning, as 2 days passed from when he got stuck, the digging continued, but the team encountered another problem: extremely hard bedrock layers that were impossible to dig through. At this point, they weren't sure if Donald was still alive, so they sent a nurse into the cave with a handheld Doppler machine to see if he still had a pulse. She couldn't detect one, but this wasn't definitive proof of death, since she only had access to his very cold legs. Sometimes, the body's core organs can continue functioning after the extremities have stopped registering a pulse. Seeing how quickly Donald's condition was deteriorating, rescuers started using their most extreme tools, including dynamite, which was extremely risky but appeared to be the only option left. On Tuesday morning, they finally managed to reach his location, and a doctor was sent in immediately, but as many feared, Donald had died. It took an entire day to retrieve his body, and an autopsy later confirmed he had succumbed to hypothermia sometime between Sunday night and Monday morning. Following his death, the cave system was restricted to limited access. Agen Allwedd incident. Roger Solari and Martin Farr, aged 26 and 23 respectively, wanted to map out the Agen Allwedd cave system in South Wales. At the time, John Parker, another explorer, had abandoned the mission after discovering a third sump in one of its longest passages. Martin and Roger, however, wanted to keep going to see what lay beyond. The first trip was done by Martin alone, because Roger had hurt his knee, making it extremely dangerous for Martin to continue solo. Reaching the third sump was a feat in itself, since the route was not only tortuous, but also extremely long, lasting for hours, as the first sump was about a mile into the cave. The first two sumps measured only 249 feet and 82 feet, so Martin passed through them relatively easily. However, the third sump was much longer, and nobody had fully explored it yet, so Martin could only hope he had enough air to reach the end. Fortunately, he managed to swim through it, about 850 feet, and on the other side he found something else interesting: a zigzagging passage, roughly 1,800 feet long, leading to another sump. Nobody had known about this fourth sump, and Martin realized he probably wouldn't have enough air to explore it and then return. He spent the next 4 to 5 hours heading back out, planning to wait for Roger so they could tackle Sump 4 together on the next trip. When they returned on June 15, 1974, both Roger and Martin brought extra air tanks. They successfully reached Sump 4 and began diving it with a guideline to help map the route. After about 400 feet, Roger finished his guideline, and he had sinus problems, even though it wasn't the first time. Despite this, they decided to continue. Martin then took out his own guideline and they kept going, but they made an important mistake. In cave diving, there is a concept called the rule of thirds for air consumption. If you use 1/3 of your air supply on the way in, you need another third to get out, leaving the final third as an emergency reserve. They had already used their first third and should have turned back when Roger's line ran out. Because Roger had a smaller tank than Martin, Martin assumed Roger would head out while he continued forward. He eventually came to a gravel wall of rock, which could have indicated the sump was ending, and possibly an air pocket. By this point, he was well past the halfway mark of his tank, so it was becoming extremely risky. He pushed on until he reached solid rock, confirming there was no air pocket. Spotting a passage to the right, he explored another 29 feet, but it ended in a dead end. When he backtracked, he was shocked to see Roger still there. Martin quickly signaled that they had to return. Roger, likely realizing he didn't have enough air to make it back, attempted to locate the same air pocket Martin had been searching for. Martin continued about 130 feet until his main tank ran out, forcing him to switch to a reserve tank. That would give him only about 300 feet in Sump 4 and another 850 feet in Sump 3, barely enough. However, he had previously placed a partially filled tank between Sump 3 and Sump 2, and he aimed to reach that. Finally emerging from Sump 4, Martin sat on the bank, waiting for Roger, who, remember, had a smaller tank. If he didn't appear soon, it would be a huge problem. After 20 minutes with no sign of Roger, Martin realized that if Roger had surfaced from Sump 4 at that moment, he likely wouldn't have enough air left to get through Sump 3. After an hour, Martin was certain Roger's air had run out. Martin entered the water again and tried pulling the guideline to make it tense, but it didn't. It was no longer connected. It had been cut at about the 430-foot mark. This was probably where Roger needed to change tanks. Because switching them wasn't a simple task at the time, he might have put his arm through the line to avoid losing it, twisted his body to reach the valve, and become tangled, forcing him to cut the line to move freely. This, combined with the silt kicked up by movement, likely reduced his visibility, and he may have swum the wrong way. At that point, there was no doubt Roger had exhausted his air. Martin stayed calm and managed to navigate the next 3 sumps safely. He alerted the authorities immediately immediately, and the search for Roger's body began. Martin himself joined the search, along with many others. However, Roger's remains were not found until 1986, 12 years later. Recovering the body was deemed too risky, so it was left in the cave, and a plaque was placed near the entrance of Sump 1 in Roger's honor. In 1987, another explorer passed through Sump 4 and finally located the air pocket, 875 feet in, the very one Roger and Martin had hoped to find. It was called the Against All Odds Chamber. Martin stated that after this incident, he never broke the rule of thirds again. He went on to have a remarkable diving career. Today, the entrance to the cave system is locked, and only specific, experienced divers are granted a key. Floyd Collins Incident. In late December 1924, Floyd Collins discovered a cave called Sand Cave, which was easily accessible to tourists because it was near a highway. He quickly struck a deal with the land's owners to receive 50% of any profits from the cave's exploration. Afterward, he immediately began working there. Since there was no significant entrance, however, many tourists avoided it. As a result, Floyd spent hours every day over the next few weeks digging deeper and deeper. On January 30th, 1925, it was snowing outside, and once again, Floyd went into the cave, only to find something shocking. Crawling forward with a lantern, he reached what was known as the turnaround room, called that way because many cavers would stop there and turn around, deeming it too risky to continue. The only way to go farther was through a tiny narrow hole called the squeeze, which measured only 9 inches in height. Floyd, however, managed to push through. Beyond the squeeze, he saw a narrow pit dropping about 10 feet. He went down feet first and reached the bottom, where he found yet another pit. Squatting down, he removed the remaining rocks and debris and finally saw an opening into the main cave. He tied a rope in place and descended an 80-foot drop. Reaching the cavern floor, he was amazed by the sight, but noticed his light was starting to dim. Wanting to avoid being left in the dark, he climbed back up the 80-foot drop and began returning, moving backwards and pushing his lantern with his shoulder. Unfortunately, his lantern slipped into a tiny hole and shattered, leaving him in total darkness. Because the cavern was extremely unstable, Floyd knew he had to move carefully to avoid dislodging loose rocks. Unable to see, however, he kicked one loose, and it fell onto his left leg, trapping him. He tried freeing himself with his right leg, but the more he moved, the more rocks tumbled down, further wedging him in place. It was 10 a.m., and he began shouting for help, hoping someone would hear him. He remained there all day, and by 9 a.m. the next morning, nearly 24 hours after he had become trapped, 2 of the cave's owners arrived with their 17-year-old son, Jewel Estes, to check on him. They saw Floyd's coat hanging outside the cave and called his name, but no one answered, so they ventured deeper. Before long, the 2 owners turned back because the passages were too tight, but Jewel continued and eventually found Floyd, who asked him to call his brothers for help. Soon, Marshall Collins, Floyd's brother, and Lee Collins, Floyd's father, reached the entrance, finding a growing crowd watching the rescue attempt. Marshall and another man went inside to widen the passage, digging carefully so as not to send loose rocks tumbling onto Floyd. At 4 p.m., Floyd's other brother Homer arrived. Floyd had previously asked Homer to come along that day, so Homer felt guilty for refusing and did his best to help. He did reach Floyd, but a new problem emerged. The crowds outside had started multiple bonfires. The melting ice funneled water into the cave, creating mud and sending freezing cold water down toward Floyd. After 8 hours with Floyd, his brothers had to rest. Upon emerging, Homer grew furious at the huge crowd, telling people to leave if they couldn't help. However, none of them listened. Reporters began arriving, hoping to interview Homer. Tired of the questions, he told them to see for themselves inside the cave. Confusion and rumors spread. Some claimed Floyd was already dead or that the cave had collapsed entirely. Determined to prove otherwise, Marshall offered a $500,000 reward to anyone who saved his brother. As rumors spread more, however, he went in to check on Floyd himself and found him alive. Floyd managed to free one hand, suggesting they tie a rope around his chest to pull him out, but as soon as they tried, he begged them to stop, saying he felt like he was being pulled in two. Homer worked continuously, removing dirt and debris until he was utterly exhausted and needed medical attention. By Tuesday night, 95 hours after Floyd had become trapped, a reporter named Skeets entered the cave and installed a light bulb near Floyd. While removing rubble, Skeets exposed more of Floyd's legs, but still couldn't free him. His story and interview with Floyd were published, drawing even larger crowds. Hotels nearby were filled, and at least 1,000 people gathered around Sand Cave. All this activity further weakened the cave walls, putting it at risk of collapse, though nobody realized it at the time, as everyone was rooting for Floyd. At hour 123, the entrance to the pit collapsed, blocking any access to Floyd and cutting off deliveries of food and water. By hour 144, a team of workers formed to dig a new tunnel to reach him. The only way they could know if Floyd was still alive was the light bulb Skeets had installed. It was connected to another bulb outside, which would flicker when Floyd breathed. They dug relentlessly, but with no food or water reaching Floyd, combined with the cold temperature, his chances were fading quickly. By Friday, February February 13th, the men had nearly reached him, and one worker reported hearing groaning about 10 feet away. However, at 1:30 a.m. on February 16th, a worker reached Floyd and found him already deceased. Initially, Floyd's body was left in the cave. After some time, though, his brother Homer arranged for its removal and gave him a proper burial. Nutty Putty Cave. John Jones, a young 26-year-old man, decided to explore the Nutty Putty Cave in the Utah desert near Salt Lake City. This wasn't his first caving experience, as he and his brother Josh used to explore caves around Utah, even though it was the first time he would have gone into the Nutty Putty Cave specifically. The cave was considered beginner-friendly, as it was well-mapped, and the first main parts were accessible to everyone, such as the maze or the big slide. There were also some harder areas for more experienced cavers, like the birth canal, which was an incredibly tight passage. John wasn't going alone. He went with a group of 11, including family and friends. The cave was closed off at the time because some cavers had previously gotten stuck, but it was reopened and accessible only to those with a specific permit. Josh managed to get one, and on November 24th, 2009, they went in. Everyone stayed in the beginner-friendly areas, but John and Josh quickly got bored and started looking for the harder tunnels they had heard about. They knew about the birth canal, one of the tightest passages in the cave, which, after the narrowest part, had a room where they could stand up and turn around to head back. They ventured into the narrow passages of the cave, and at one point, they reached an area called the Corkscrew, named that way because of how hard it was to get through. It was after the Corkscrew that cavers would normally turn around, but 5 years before, an accident had happened in that exact spot. A 16-year-old boy named Brock Clark got stuck there, even though he was just 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed only 140 pounds. He had to wait a whole 14 hours before getting freed. John, however, was 6 feet tall and weighed 200 pounds, so he clearly knew he couldn't turn around to go back in that specific part of the tunnel. In a space only 12 inches high, he squeezed his stomach in and kept moving forward until he got to a point where he was headfirst at a downward angle. It looked like there was an area ahead where he could finally turn around, so he kept going in. But what he didn't know was that beyond that ledge, the area was uncharted. No one had been there before him. He still thought he was in some part of the birth canal, and since he knew many cavers felt stuck just like he was, but eventually found a place to turn around, he continued on. After a while, however, he started sliding toward the bottom of the tunnel, almost doing a handstand to hold on and try to push himself back up. He immediately yelled to his brother to stop, and they started discussing what they should do, as John's arms were starting to lose strength. They decided to move forward just a little more and then turn around, because John saw a hole in the floor ahead that he thought might lead to a larger space. What he didn't realize, however, was that it was just a dead-end opening at the bottom of the tunnel. So once he went in, he was stuck in a vertical position, upside down. The opening was just 18 by 10 inches, and any effort to get out proved useless, so he screamed for help. His brother Josh came in feet first and squeezed one of John's legs with his own, trying to pull him out. This also didn't work, and after Josh became exhausted, they decided that he would exit the cave to call for help. John waited there upside down, and gravity kept pushing him further into the opening, with his chest getting compressed against the walls, allowing him to take only small breaths. The first rescuer arrived after 3 hours. She had a rope tied to her ankle, so she could be pulled back out while she put another rope around John's legs to try to pull him out. This also didn't work, so they decided to install a pulley system, which was much stronger than just a human pull, and it was what had gotten Brock Clark free 5 years prior. However, this required a lot of time, since each piece of equipment had to be brought through the entire cave, which took nearly an hour. Also, only one assistant at a time could be there, and only small tools could be brought in. After spending the whole night there, John's body was starting to show the signs of being upside down for more than 12 hours. He had been completely lucid up to that point, but now he was starting to lose his sanity, hallucinating. The oxygen concentration in the air was also dropping lower and lower. During this time, they brought in a device that allowed him to speak with his wife, who encouraged him to hang on. John assured her that he would be out with her soon. Around 4 o'clock, the pulleys were ready, so rescuer Ryan Schurz, who was inside the cave, grabbed John's legs and they activated the pulley. John started screaming in agony as his legs turned blue and no longer had a pulse, telling them to stop. After a brief pause to let him calm down, they tried again, and it seemed to be working. John rose high enough that Ryan was able to make eye contact with him and give him some Gatorade through a tube. His situation was still very bad, however, as his lifeless legs were hitting the ceiling and blocking him from getting out of the hole. They were strongly considering breaking his legs, as time was really starting to run out. Then, the rope holding the pulley broke, pulling everything toward Ryan's face and injuring his face, lips, tongue, and causing a concussion. He lost consciousness briefly, and when he woke up, he immediately left the cave. Meanwhile, John had slipped back into the hole, and it took another hour to repair the pulley. When they tried pulling him out once more, John wasn't responding. Since it would have been impossible to lift him without his help, they sent a medic inside the cave to check whether he was still alive. At 11:56 on November 25th, John Jones was declared dead. The entire cave system was then closed off with concrete, and they placed a plaque to commemorate John Jones's life. Jiudan Cave. Two friends, Wang Yuan and Wang Tao, were highly experienced divers who wanted to enter Jiudan Cave in China to break their own personal depth record. Someone had previously placed a guideline that extended for 525 feet, but they wanted to extend it by another 35 feet, aiming for a total depth of 558 feet. This plan would require them to leave the existing guideline for some time, and because those depths are already dangerous, doing so would have significantly increased the risk. However, they were not only diving experts in general, but also had already completed 15 dives in the cave's northern entrance, so they felt quite confident. They even decided to do a practice dive in open water to reach 500 feet, just to see what it would be like and identify potential problems. Unfortunately, Tao had to skip the practice dive due to illness, so Yuan went alone, and everything went smoothly. On April 18, 2014, after months of preparation, they decided it was time to begin their dive. They estimated it would take about 20 minutes to reach their target depth, and they would only be able to stay there for a few minutes before starting their ascent. Even just a few extra minutes at those depths would require many additional hours of decompression. They also estimated it would take about 3 hours and 50 minutes to get back to the surface safely, allowing enough time for the pressure to not be too harsh on their bodies. Time was of the essence, as every minute mattered. When they started their descent, they noticed that visibility was greatly reduced because of the rainfall in the days prior, but they decided it was not bad enough to postpone the dive. Under normal conditions, divers could usually see about 50 feet ahead, but on that day, visibility was only about 6.5 feet. As extra safety measures, they had previously placed air tanks at various depths, each containing the appropriate gas mixture for that depth. Additionally, a friend named Pei stayed near the cave's surface to assist if needed. Yuan's role was to keep them on the guideline, while Tao's role was to place arrow markers along the line to indicate the direction back to the cave entrance. At such extreme depths, having the correct gas mixture is crucial because both nitrogen and oxygen can become problematic under high pressure. They followed all the guidelines carefully, switching tanks at the appropriate depths. However, around 538 feet, Yuan suddenly felt as though he might lose consciousness. Realizing they needed to ascend to counter these symptoms, and considering they were only 13 feet beyond the established guideline, with visibility around half that distance, they turned back toward the line and the surface. Yuan led them to where the guideline should have been, but they were met with a terrifying situation. The guideline was gone. They searched desperately, hoping to feel or spot it, and eventually found it. But now, there was another problem. Their panic at losing the line had caused them to breathe faster, which consumed more gas than normal. By the time they rediscovered the line, Yuan's cylinder for that depth was nearly empty, so he had to switch back to his main tank, which contained surface air. This was far from ideal. Although he initially felt okay, around the 393-foot mark, he began trembling involuntarily. They desperately needed to reach their next set of cylinders, which were at 243 feet, about 150 feet away. Yuan still had hope until he looked down and saw Tao stuck under a rock. Because of the low visibility, Tao had accidentally swam into the rock and gotten wedged there. Yuan also noticed that Tao wasn't attempting to free himself, but was instead shining his light at his neck, signaling that he was running out of air. Yuan immediately gave Tao an emergency mouthpiece, and Tao freed himself. They resumed their ascent with very little air left, sharing what remained. After some quick calculations, they realized they had roughly 3 minutes of air before it would be gone. Tao was extremely fatigued, and Yuan had to pull him by the arm. When they were about 300 feet from the surface, Yuan checked his air supply again, and saw there was only enough for one person to ascend another 130 feet. Fortunately, about 50 feet away were the next set of cylinders they had placed earlier. Suddenly, Yuan saw Tao float past him, rising upward and disappearing in the murky water. Yuan knew Tao must have lost consciousness because he made no attempt to hold on. Yuan swam after him as quickly as he could, but he couldn't see Tao anywhere. With his tank about to run dry, he had to reach the next set of cylinders before searching again. He quickly got to those cylinders, switched tanks, and went back to look for Tao. As he descended once more, he still couldn't find him. His new tank began to run low, so he had to ascend again to the next set of cylinders. Unfortunately, those cylinders were placed at a higher depth because they were meant for use in shallower water, and they would be extremely dangerous to use at deeper depths. If someone were to use those tanks and descend too far, they would risk nitrogen narcosis, a state similar to drunkenness, as nitrogen is absorbed too rapidly. Despite this risk, Yuan still tried to go deeper in search of Tao. At some point, he lost consciousness briefly, and although he woke up moments later, it was the warning sign that he needed to get out immediately. immediately. He attempted to follow the necessary decompression stops on the way up, but in his panicked and weakened state, he ascended faster than he should have, stopping for about 3 hours instead of the nearly 4 hours required. Upon surfacing, Yuan immediately told Pei what had happened. Shocked, Pei dove in to search for Tao, but soon realized Yuan might also be in serious trouble because of his rapid ascent. Matter of fact, when Pei returned to the surface, he found Yuan showing symptoms of both nitrogen narcosis and decompression sickness. As soon as Yuan removed his regulator, he began vomiting and twitching, experiencing severe dizziness. They had no choice but to abandon the immediate search for Tao in order to get Yuan urgent medical help. By this time, Yuan was in agonizing pain, especially in his legs. Fortunately, rescuers arrived quickly, but before anyone could re-enter the cave, they needed a full day to plan and gather the correct tanks for those depths. By then, it was almost certain that Tao had died, and the following day, his lifeless body was found at a depth of 176 feet. Yuan spent several days in a decompression chamber, but ultimately made a full recovery. Kalimba Cave Tragedy. It was December 2004, and 9 divers were about to enter the Kalimba cenote for the second time while on vacation in Mexico. Their plan was to follow the guidelines to the Boschchen cenote before turning back. They split into 2 groups. The first would go ahead and set markers to highlight the correct path, while the second would follow. Since the first group had more efficient oxygen tanks, they planned to go farther before returning, while the second group would start heading back earlier. As Team 2 was expected to resurface first, they would remove a specific type of marker called cookies to signal their exit. Seeing that the cookies were gone, Team 1 would then remove their own markers on the way back, ensuring the cave remained clean for future divers. Everything went according to plan. Team 1, noticing the absence of the cookies, began their ascent, but when they resurfaced, Team 2 was nowhere to be found. They searched the area for 30 minutes but found no sign of them. Regrouping at the Kalimba cenote, they geared up to re-enter the tunnel and search for them. By this point, Team 2 had little oxygen left, but suddenly, bubbles appeared in the water, and 2 divers quickly resurfaced. They immediately began explaining what had happened underwater. Instead of following the intended exit path, Team 2 had mistakenly turned left. The return trip should have been short, but they only realized their mistake after swimming 1,400 feet in the wrong direction. By the time they noticed, they were nearly 3,000 feet from the original exit. However, another exit was just 300 feet away. Reaching it posed a serious challenge. They needed to cross a 70-foot gap with no guidelines, making it a dangerous risk of getting lost. Kent, one of the divers, took out his safety line, secured it, and began swimming across. He was just short of reaching the guideline when his line stopped him. It was too short to cover the long gap. Time was running out, and turning back, Kent saw the rest of the group heading toward the initial path, so he swam fast to catch up. By then, their oxygen levels were critically low, and with no air pockets in the cave, the situation was becoming life-threatening. After 25 minutes of swimming, they finally reached the correct line. A 30-minute swim still lay between them and the exit. Bill's oxygen was nearly gone, with only 200 psi left. He moved next to Jean, who had more air, and she shared hers using her emergency extra mouthpiece. The situation was so bad that in tight passages, Bill had to hold his breath while Jean squeezed through first. Then Michael also began running dangerously low on air. Seeing that Jean and Bill were already sharing and could not help him, he panicked. He was the least experienced of the group, and his tank was almost empty. Fortunately, Kent reached him in time, handed him his emergency mouthpiece, and tried to calm him down. Meanwhile, Jean and Bill made it out with just 500 psi left in Jean's tank. Had they been delayed just a few more minutes, they would have drowned. They immediately informed the others that Michael and Kent were behind them. Their lights had been visible just before they exited. The remaining divers quickly re-entered the tunnel, hoping to find them in time. Just 250 feet inside, they spotted Michael and Kent's lights, but something was wrong. They weren't moving. As they got closer, the truth became clear. Both had run out of oxygen and drowned, just 5 minutes from the exit. William Coughlin. It was May 28, 1993, when 26-year-old William Coughlin, with a newfound passion for caving, decided to visit a cave in Kentucky with his friends James and Kevin. The cave was divided into 2 sections: the historic tour, which was accessible to most visitors, and the more dangerous wild tour, reserved for experienced and daring people. After completing the easier historic tour, the guide asked if they wanted to proceed with the more challenging wild tour. Once they agreed, they were required to sign a document, acknowledging the risks involved and absolving the operators of any responsibility. This should have been the first red flag, and Kevin decided to opt out, returning to the safer area. The remaining group, now consisting of William, James, and 4 other participants, was led by the guide into the wild tour. He stressed the importance of staying close and reminded them of the potential dangers. As they descended into the lower sections of the cave, they encountered a 30-foot hanging cable ladder with wooden rungs. After climbing down and going a bit forward, there was a second, shorter ladder, about 20 feet long, positioned over a rocky outcrop. At the bottom bottom of the second ladder, the guide informed the group that the official tour had ended. He mentioned they could explore nearby passages if they wished, but noted that they were running behind schedule and that he needed to step away briefly for a phone call. He left the group at the base of the ladder, and this is when William decided to explore a passage he had noticed earlier. He discussed it with James, who agreed, and William attempted to climb back up the second ladder. However, the climb proved difficult. He was 6 feet tall and weighed 220 pounds. Struggling to ascend, William decided to wait for the guide instead. As time passed and the guide didn't return, William attempted to climb the ladder again. Tragically, halfway up, he lost his grip and fell violently, striking his head on a protruding rock before landing hard on the ground. Blood began pooling from his head, and James rushed to help him. Although William remained conscious, he was delirious and visibly stunned. When the guide finally returned, he instructed the group to climb back out the way they came. However, William's condition made this impossible. James, frustrated, demanded the guide call a cave rescue team, but the guide dismissed the idea, insisting that the group work together to get William out. James began to suspect the guide was avoiding involving authorities, perhaps to prevent panic among other visitors. The group decided their best option was to bypass the second ladder entirely and take an alternative route through a narrow, previously mapped corridor not part of the official tour. With teamwork, they managed to navigate the initial section, carrying William with them. However, the real challenge came when they reached a rough, sharp V-shaped passage, which made gripping difficult. When it was William's turn, he went in head first, but his size made it an extremely tight fit. Halfway through, he became stuck and realized he couldn't move forward or backward. Trapped in a horizontal position with his arms pinned beneath him, he began to panic. The tightness of the passage compressed his chest, making it difficult for him to breathe. The group's attempts to pull him out were futile. As panic set in, the guide instructed James to exit the cave and inform the owner of the situation. James rushed to the surface, but the owner appeared reluctant to involve authorities. The guide, finally recognizing the severity of the situation, went out to get a medkit and to call for emergency services. It took 3 hours for rescue and medical personnel to arrive. Meanwhile, James stayed by William's side, trying to keep him calm, but William's responses grew slower and more slurred until he eventually stopped responding altogether. When rescuers reached William, they faced immense challenges. The downward angle of the passage made it difficult to revive him. They brought in heaters to protect him from hypothermia and began evacuating the rest of the group, leaving only James behind to witness what was happening to his friend. A pulley system was installed to try to free William, but every tug caused him immense pain, so much so that he once again started groaning in agony. The rescue team worked tirelessly throughout Saturday, but after 17 hours of efforts, William was tragically pronounced dead. It took an additional 7 hours to extract his body from the cave. Hermit Cave Incident. It was April 5, 1999, when 21-year-old Robert Kennedy from Oklahoma set out on what was supposed to be a normal overnight camping trip near Hermit Cave. He was accompanied by 2 others, his stepbrother Richard and their mutual friend Ben. During the night, they gathered around a campfire and discussed the nearby cave, sharing legends and stories about its mysterious reputation. The next morning, as they were packing up to head home, their curiosity about the cave got the better of them. The cave was largely unmapped, adding an air of intrigue, so Robert proposed a quick exploration. Ben, however, had to leave early for work, so he headed back home, leaving Robert and Richard to decide for themselves. Robert and Richard entered the cave through its relatively large main entrance without much difficulty. Inside, Robert spotted one of the rumored side passages they had been talking about and decided to explore it. The narrow passage was too tight for more than one person, so Richard decided to wait outside the cave. Robert promised not to go too deep and assured Richard he'd be back soon. As Robert crawled forward, he encountered a section of the cave that was about 150 feet long and full of tight curves, making progress challenging. The real trouble began when he reached a particular point, called the Keyhole Formation. This section was especially dangerous because it was impossible to exit legs, first once passed. Unaware of this, Robert continued forward, but when the passage narrowed even further, he decided it was time to turn back. Returning to the Keyhole Formation, Robert realized something terrible. He couldn't pass through it feet first. His only option was to move forward through the even tighter crevice, hoping the cave would widen enough beyond it for him to turn around. What he didn't know was that the crevice sloped downward at a 30-degree angle. Exhausted, Robert squeezed through the space, exhaling all the air from his lungs just to fit. After several pushes, he reached a horrifying realization. He was stuck. Gravity was working against him, and every attempt to move only worsened his situation. Desperate, Robert began yelling for help, but Richard, waiting outside the cave, couldn't hear him. Worried after some time, Richard ventured into the cave by himself. Though he had no flashlight because Robert had taken the only one. Crawling in complete darkness, Richard called out for Robert, who immediately yelled back, letting him know he was trapped and struggling to breathe. Realizing he couldn't reach his stepbrother in the pitch black, Richard left the cave to call for help, and about an hour later, a team of 10 rescuers arrived and began assessing the situation. The primary problem was Robert's location. He was trapped in an extremely deep area, approximately 150 feet from the cave's main entrance. This meant that drilling a shaft from above wasn't an option, so the only way to reach him was through the inside of the cave. The rescuers themselves began experiencing breathing difficulties due to the tight space, so they installed a ventilation system to pump warm air into the passages. Only one rescuer could work at a time due to the cave's tightness, and armed with manual tools, they began trying to widen the keyhole formation. However, the lack of space severely limited their maneuverability, and time was running out. Robert's breathing became more difficult, and he eventually stopped cooperating, making faint gurgling sounds, a sign of potential suffocation. After hours of effort, the rescuers managed to excavate through the keyhole formation and reach Robert's feet. Though unconscious, they felt a faint pulse, which gave them enough hope to try to get him out as quickly as possible. They immediately tried to pull him free, but unfortunately, the attempt failed. A pulley system was considered, but the cave's limestone and gypsum walls were too fragile to support the tension. With no other options, they continued digging around his body, which took an additional hour. When they finally freed Robert, they rushed him outside, where paramedics were waiting. Tragically, it was too late. After 5 hours of relentless rescue operations, Robert Kennedy was pronounced dead. Black Cave Tragedy. In April 1995, Thomas Edward Benning decided to visit Black Cave in Arizona. Having explored the cave before, he felt confident that this would be a relatively safe trip. He entered the cave alone, equipped only with an electric miner's lamp and no helmet. The first part of the cave was familiar to him, and he navigated it without any issues. However, at one point, he noticed a secret side passage that caught his attention. Drawn by curiosity, Thomas strayed from the main route he usually took and began exploring the darker, narrower passage. After venturing deeper into the unfamiliar passage for some time, Thomas decided it was time to turn back. But to his growing concern, he realized that an hour had passed and he was completely lost. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't retrace his steps to the familiar route. As panic began to set in, his situation worsened. His lamp started to flicker and eventually went out, leaving him in total darkness, miles underground. With no source of light, Thomas turned to his last resort, a box of matches. Striking one, he managed to create a faint glow that barely illuminated the rocks around him. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He continued forward, using one match after another, but the matches burned out quickly, and soon he ran out entirely, leaving him once again surrounded by absolute darkness. Despite the circumstances, Thomas refused to give up. He devised a plan to leave behind small, useless items as markers to avoid circling back to the same spots. Starving, dehydrated, and utterly exhausted, he pressed on until he encountered the fissure, a narrow crack in the rock barely 4 feet deep. Believing this might be his only chance to reconnect with the familiar route or find a larger opening, he decided to enter it feet first. As he lowered himself into the gap, his hips dropped below the narrowest point, and he suddenly realized his mistake. He was completely wedged. His hips were firmly stuck between the rock walls, rendering him immobile. Using every last ounce of his strength, Thomas tried to lift himself back up, but it was no use. He was now trapped, alone, in the dark, with no one able to hear him. Days passed, and Thomas remained in the same position, growing weaker with each passing moment. Back home, his wife grew increasingly worried when he failed to return. She contacted the police, who began an extensive search of the caves in the area. Unfortunately, Thomas hadn't told anyone exactly which cave he planned to visit, leaving rescuers to search blindly. Miraculously, rescuers eventually spotted his car parked near Black Cave. A rescue team entered the cave, carefully exploring all the mapped sections. They found some of Thomas's belongings, including his glasses and shirt, but they missed the secret side passage he had ventured into. Amazingly, Thomas was still alive at this point, though his condition was rapidly deteriorating. Days passed, and with no further progress, authorities unfortunately called off the search. Thomas was officially declared missing. Refusing to give up, his wife continued pleading with authorities to resume the search. She distributed flyers around the city and reached out to anyone who might have information, but unfortunately, she wouldn't have known about her husband for a long time. It wasn't until December 1996, over a year and a half later, that 3 other cavers exploring Black Cave stumbled upon Thomas's remains in the dark, narrow passage where he had become trapped. Zacaton Sinkhole Incident. On April 6, 1994, diving legend Shek Exley, the first person in the world to log over 100 cave dives, set out to break a new depth record. His goal was to dive through the Zacaton sinkhole in Mexico, one of the deepest water-filled sinkholes in the world, plunging over 1,000 feet. Shek's passion for deep diving began at a young age when he and his brother would compete to see how deep they could go. Tragically, during one such competition, his brother lost consciousness at around 50 feet and drowned. Despite this, Shek pursued his love for diving, becoming an expert. For context, the average diver is advised not to descend deeper than 150 feet, with 300 feet considered the absolute limit for experienced divers. Accompanied by fellow diver Jim Bowden, Shek meticulously prepared for the record-breaking dive. The event drew TV reporters, who wanted to witness this extraordinary feat. As the two divers descended into the Zacaton sinkhole, they wished each other luck. Although diving together, their dives would be independent. Exley had trained for this attempt, pushing his limits in previous dives. During one preparation dive at Bushman's Hole in South Africa, however, something weird happened. He reached an astonishing depth of 863 feet, but experienced alarming symptoms. He began hallucinating, and his body trembled uncontrollably, which are classic signs of high-pressure nervous syndrome, or HPNS. HPNS typically manifests at depths beyond 500 feet and is believed to result from the compression of cell membranes in the central nervous system. The condition can cause confusion, tremors, and even hallucinations, making it incredibly dangerous for divers at those depths. To mitigate these risks, Shek and Bowden planned to descend slowly, carefully switching tanks as they reached new depths. For the first stretch of their dive, everything went smoothly. However, problems began to arise at around 800 feet. Bowden noticed slight trembling in his hands, an early warning sign of HPNS. At 900 feet, Bowden encountered another issue. His air supply was running critically low. His tank pressure had dropped to 1,080 psi, far below the expected 1,800 psi needed to ensure a safe ascent. Keep in mind that decompression, depending on how deep the divers go, can take up to hours, which meant that Bowden was now in a life or death situation. Realizing the danger, Bowden began his ascent immediately, hoping he could make it back to the surface in time. Exley, however, was in even greater trouble. At around 880 feet, his vision blurred, and his body began trembling uncontrollably. HPNS symptoms, combined with nitrogen narcosis, which is a condition akin to being drunk caused by high-pressure nitrogen, began impairing his ability to think clearly. To steady himself, Exley wrapped his descent line around his arms, but his symptoms worsened, causing him to breathe more rapidly and deplete his air supply at an alarming rate. In a desperate move, he switched tanks, but at such depths, this was not ideal. Disoriented and overwhelmed by his symptoms, Exley became unable to think straight or move. Bowden, ascending cautiously, noticed Exley's descent line with unused tanks still attached. While concerned, he assumed Exley might have successfully reached the sinkhole's bottom and was making his way back up slowly. However, on the surface, the support team grew suspicious. They observed bubbles rising to the surface, but only from one diver, Bowden. A support diver, alarmed, wrote on an underwater slate, "Where's Shek?" She decided to descend to 250 feet to investigate. At 280 feet, she spotted something chilling, two small white squares hanging from Exley's descent line. Upon closer inspection, she realized they were pages from Exley's diving profile, tools he had used to meticulously plan his dive. The realization was devastating. Shek was stuck somewhere deep below. Nearly 10 hours after their initial descent, Bowden miraculously surfaced, surviving his own life-threatening dive. Exley, however, a hero that had previously saved numerous other divers, remained in the depths of the Zacaton sinkhole. 3 days later, the recovery team pulled his descent line to the surface, bringing Exley's lifeless body with it. Jim Bowden reached an extraordinary depth of 915 feet during the dive, setting a world record for open-circuit scuba diving. The Manchester Hole tragedy. In November 2005, 14-year-old Joseph Lister, along with 10 classmates, including his friends Charlie and Amy from his school, his math teacher, and a 17-year-old caver volunteer who knew the cave system well, decided to explore the Nidderdale Caves in North Yorkshire, England. The cave system is famous for its 20 entrances, and the group chose to enter through Manchester Hole, a small opening in the ground that leads to a huge cave. They descended through a hole into a massive chamber, about the size of a football field, with a few inches of water on the floor and a 50-foot-high ceiling hung with stalactites. After passing through, they entered a tunnel and climbed down a muddy path into a second, smaller chamber that still held all 11 students and had shallow water. The tunnel then narrowed sharply, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees for 40 feet through twisting passages. At the bottom, a muddy stream soaked their clothes, but led to a small chamber where they could stand again. The math teacher was the last to follow the group. When he reached the small chamber, the guide became very worried because the water level was much higher than usual, something he had never seen before. Even though it was cold cold and windy outside, there was no forecast of rain. Everyone was standing in freezing water. Their boots were filled with water, and there was hardly any space to move. To make matters worse, the water kept rising, soon reaching above the knees of some students. The guide, confused by the sudden flooding, knew they had to get out quickly, so they decided to retreat. The math teacher went first, followed by the students, one by one, taking the small passage back to the previous chamber. At one point, the teacher and 9 of the students were inside the tunnel when a sudden surge of cold water flooded the chamber. The guide, along with Amy and Joseph, were the last to exit the chamber and enter the tunnel. The tunnel was crowded with students struggling against the rising water. Realizing the danger, the guide, Amy, and Joseph went back to the previous chamber to catch their breath, but the water kept rising and they were nearly submerged. Taking a deep breath, they re-entered the tunnel. This time, the tunnel was clear enough for them to move. The guide led the way, with Amy and Joseph following closely. However, in the previous chamber, the guide pushed Amy out to safety, but Joseph never made it out. The water continued to rise, even in the chamber. The guide tried to go back for Joseph, but the math teacher insisted on taking the other 10 students to safety. Tragically, Joseph drowned in the narrow tunnel, where there was no air. After the incident, the group went to the surface to alert emergency personnel, and they emerged under a blue sky with strong winds but not a single drop of rain. It was later revealed that strong winds had blown water out of the nearby Scar House Reservoir that day. Thousands of gallons of water were forced into the river below, causing it to rise 4 feet in just 1 hour. This surge of water drained directly into the cave system. Normally, water slowly trickles through and seeps into the groundwater, but that day the huge volume overwhelmed the cave's ability to drain, triggering flash flooding throughout the system in just a few minutes. Cave rescuers arrived within 20 minutes after being called. By then, the water had already receded to below their knees. They found the lifeless body of Joseph Lister in the narrow tunnel before the final chamber. Neil Moss Incident. It was Sunday, March 22, 1959, when 20-year-old Oxford philosophy student Oscar Neil Moss, along with 7 other people, 4 of whom were part of the British Caving Association, decided to visit Peak Cavern in the village of Castleton, Derbyshire. The cave system was well known. However, 2 weeks earlier, the same 4 BCA explorers had discovered a new fissure in a side chamber that was 1,000 feet deep. The 8 explorers entered the cave system in the afternoon. They were equipped with ropes, lamps, helmets, and other necessary caving materials. Upon entering, they discovered the Mucky Ducks section, a wet squeeze tunnel that was frequently flooded after rain. This led them to the Boulder Passage, an easier section where they could stand upright while descending and maneuver around various obstructions. Approximately 493 feet into the passage, a 10-feet climb on the north wall of the upper gallery awaited them. High above the steep, muddy slopes was Pickering Passage, a long, narrow crawl space where you had to stretch your whole body to move through. It concluded with an awkward bend and a muddy sump. Above the eye hole, just large enough to accommodate a human body, laid the next challenge. It led to a thigh-deep, muddy pool that connected to the stalagmite chamber, a vast, beautiful part of the cave filled with stalagmites, with a ceiling high enough for a person to stand upright. Despite their fatigue, they approached the newly discovered fissure in the ground. The shaft measured around 3.2 feet by 2.3 feet. None had ventured all the way down there, but it was estimated to be at least 40 feet deep. To be safe, they decided to deploy a 250 feet climbing ladder, and Neil volunteered to go down. He started to descend around 3:30 p.m., pushing the ladder before continuing. He went down 12 feet when he met his first challenge, the corkscrew twist. He succeeded in pushing himself into a 10-foot-long, slightly inclined passageway, and then crawled through it, pushing the ladder as he went. Afterwards, he came face to face with a vertical passageway 18 feet deep, a section none had ventured into before. Throughout his descent, he maintained constant communication with his team above. Excited, Moss dropped further down the tunnel, but unfortunately, he met a boulder there. He knew he couldn't continue descending, so he decided to climb back up. Unfortunately, Moss found himself unable to lift his feet sufficiently to ascend the ladder. He became trapped in an elliptical crevice only 18 inches wide. He called out for assistance, and despite efforts to lift him by pulling on the ladder, it became jammed between the cave surface and his body. Ropes were lowered to help him, but every time they tried to pull him up, they either snapped or got cut by the sharp edge of the rock. His body ended up blocking air from getting into the shaft, so he needed to be rescued immediately before he ran out of oxygen. Some of the cavers left to seek more help. Within a few hours, hundreds of volunteers from across England, along with the Royal Air Force, police, and even the Navy, joined the rescue efforts. Just a few hours after Moss became trapped in the shaft, the rescuers encountered another obstacle. By this time, the air in the shaft had become polluted by carbon dioxide. Moss became disoriented because of it, and he began behaving irrationally. Witnesses said that he wasn't helping at all, that he didn't seem to care about how serious the situation was, and that he even told the rescuers to take a break to get something to eat. Experienced cave cavers were sent down the shaft to rescue Moss, but one by one, they were forced back by the toxic air. 3 of the volunteers even lost consciousness. Finally, the 4th volunteer, Ron Peters, managed to secure a rope around Moss's chest and began to pull. However, he soon realized that this only worsened Moss's breathing difficulties. The Royal Air Force brought oxygen tanks to ventilate the shaft, and although the quality of air was marginally improved, it proved to be insufficient. The next morning, 18-year-old June Bailey arrived and suggested breaking Neil's collarbone to help rescue him. However, the toxic air stopped all their efforts, and they had to turn back. By Monday afternoon, roughly 24 hours after Moss entered the cave, he was still breathing, but it started to rain, and the entire cave was evacuated as a precaution. When it stopped, the rescuers went back to the shaft accompanied by a Royal Air Force doctor. They did not hear a sound. Moss was not breathing, and he was declared dead on Tuesday, March 24, 1959. Throughout the ordeal, Moss's father, Eric Moss, stayed at the entrance and asked that his son's body remain where it was to avoid risking further injury or loss of life during the rescue. The shaft was sealed with rocks from the stalagmite chamber. That chamber, which held the shaft, later became known as the Moss Chamber, his final resting place. The Manatee Springs Cave diving tragedy. On March 14, 2022, a couple of friends, William and Harry, and their respective fathers, George and Jack, decided to visit the Manatee Springs State Park in Florida to do some cave diving. At Manatee Springs State Park, divers need to have full cave diving certification and must dive with a partner who has previous diving experience at Manatee in order to access the cave area. All 4 divers had only the intro to cave diving certification, not the full one. The Manatee Springs system is known for its 4 entry points: Manatee Springs, mainly for open water divers; Catfish Hotel, Sue's Sink, and Freedman's Sink. The cave tunnels below these points extend for thousands of feet, but only Freedman's Sink and Catfish Hotel have an entrance pool for cave divers. The system is called a siphon because water flows like a river from a distant entry point and naturally comes out at Manatee Springs. Due to this flow, cave divers typically enter at one point and exit downstream at another. This type of dive, known as a traverse, is more challenging because divers must know 2 pathways instead of just one. Entering a siphon and a traverse system was only allowed for full certified cave divers. Regardless, they decided to enter the system at Freedman's Sink and planned to exit at Catfish Hotel. They started their dive at 11:17 a.m. Each diver equipped with 2 air tanks, both filled to 3,800 psi. Since the tunnels were about 100 feet deep, roughly 4 atmospheres of pressure, the air was compressed to 1/4 of its original volume and consumed at 4 times the surface rate. They all carried both primary and backup light sources, as well as dive computers to track their depth, heart rate, movement, and time. Additionally, William and Harry had a GoPro in their head to document the entire dive. William and Harry took the lead, with their dads following closely behind. The gentle pull of the water from Freedman's Sink helped them cover the 1,700 feet distance to Catfish Hotel. After the first 900 feet, they came to an exit line at Sue's Sink. A rope tied to a rock marked the spot, and light from the surface was seeping into the tunnel. This exit was meant for emergencies only, because it wasn't set up for divers but for campers. Their planned exit, Catfish Hotel, was 700 feet away. They kept diving and eventually reached the end of the route near Manatee Springs, but they couldn't see the exit line to Catfish Hotel. Confused, they started searching for any light coming from above, but found nothing. Fathers and sons teamed up and decided to return by following the line. At that moment, George had 3,000 psi of air remaining, which was enough to exit safely. However, the return trip turned out to be more difficult than expected. They were moving against the current, so their air consumption increased rapidly as their breathing rate went up. Finally, George spotted the exit at Sue's Sink and noticed light leaking from the surface. George and his son William emerged from the system at 12 p.m. However, their friends didn't make it out. Something had gone wrong. William wanted to dive back down to find Harry and Jack, but George insisted on calling 911 instead. Harry and Jack had apparently missed the exit at Sue's Sink. Their lighting equipment washed out the natural light leaking from the surface, and boulders further blocked it, so they didn't see the exit. They continued diving desperately for another 20 minutes, searching for any exit. Finally, Harry spotted the light at Freedman's Sink. Rushing ahead along the guideline, he looked back to see his dad's camera light following him. Harry managed to exit the system at 12:20 p.m. with one tank completely empty and the other below 1,500 psi, but his father Jack did not emerge. William and George met up with Harry at Freedman's Sink, and they talked about why they had missed the exit at Catfish Hotel. They later realized there was no upline leading to Catfish Hotel. Deep inside the cave, they could see light from the surface, but it was partly blocked by a 10-foot deep passage arranged in a double L shape, a detail they wouldn't have known without prior experience. In fact, many divers enter through Catfish Hotel and exit at Freedman's Sink because it's easier, even though they have to dive against the current. Cave rescuers arrived around 12:50 p.m. and found Jack's lifeless body just 100 feet from the exit at Friedman's Sink. Both of his tanks were completely empty. He had traveled 3,400 feet through the system and ran out of air in the last 100 feet. His final movement was recorded at 12:17 p.m., just 3 minutes before his son surfaced and 17 minutes after his friends surfaced at Sue's Sink. The Santa Rosa Blue Hole Tragedy. On March 26, 2016, two skilled cave divers went on a dangerous mission to map an unexplored part of a cave system in Santa Rosa, New Mexico. Unfortunately, something terrible happened. Deeper caves beneath its floor were sealed in 1976 after two divers died. In 2016, after reopening the entrance, a 10-person team, including experienced cave divers Mike Young and Navy veteran Shane Thompson, spent 3 days exploring the reopened tunnels and chambers. On the third and last day, Mike and Shane planned to explore a very tight spot at 140 feet, then move down to another narrow opening at 165 feet. Shane was told to wait at the open area and not go past the second opening himself. Beyond the 165-foot point, there were 5 more tight spots before the cave's last known area. Mike followed a guideline that had been set earlier, moving through boulders and squeezing through narrow passages while carrying tanks on his side and a rebreather unit. Shane had been following Mike up to the 165-foot opening. There, Mike told him to wait, but as soon as Mike was out of sight, Shane decided to follow him, even though that was against their plan. Mike did not know that Shane was right behind him. Shane followed the guideline along a rocky path over large boulders and sharp bends until he reached a narrow 3-foot opening. At that point, the water was full of silt, and he ran into another tight passage. He turned his body and tried to pull himself along the wall, but his back-mounted rebreather got caught on a rock sticking out from the tunnel ceiling. With one arm forward and the other touching the cave wall and the guideline, he twisted, trying to free himself. Soon he found that he was stuck between the rocks. Moving backwards could have damaged his rebreather, which would have been very dangerous. As he panicked, his breathing became fast and shallow. Suddenly, Mike's arm hit Shane's head, and they ended up face to face at about 195 feet deep. Mike was surprised to find Shane there, and Shane said he was stuck and needed help. Mike tried for several minutes to free him, but they began to panic because the tunnel was too tight for both of them to move if Shane remained trapped. Finally, Mike pushed Shane in just the right way to free his rebreather and pulled him through the tight spot. Shane then went back through the restriction he had just escaped, scraping himself on the rocks but avoiding getting stuck like the first time. Mike followed, but soon noticed that Shane had accidentally moved the guideline, leaving Mike unable to see where to go in the boulder-filled passage. Meanwhile, Shane continued along the winding path and faced yet another narrow passage. Still in panic, he moved too quickly and got the guideline tangled around his legs. He managed to free himself but lost the guideline in the process. His heart began to race and his breathing sped up. This was dangerous because rebreathers needed controlled breathing to work properly. With no clear exit and only tight holes around him, he could not reach the guideline he had seen just outside where he was trapped. He started to hyperventilate and could not calm down. At that moment, Mike reappeared. Seeing that Shane was very scared, Mike moved around the rocks to find an opening. He grabbed Shane by the shoulders and turned him around. Shane, seeing a way out, lunged forward and swam under Mike, but he became trapped again, this time underneath Mike's body, unable to move forward. In desperation, Shane thrashed and kicked while Mike protected his face from the blows. During the struggle, Shane's heels tore Mike's suit and scraped him against the rocks before Shane finally broke free. Afterwards, Mike realized he was still able to function and that his equipment was mostly okay, except for a ripped suit valve that let the 52 degrees Fahrenheit water in. He had also lost a fin, but managed to get it back soon after. With his nerves wrecked, Shane continued along the guideline, determined to escape. His rebreather could not keep up with his fast breathing, so he switched to his emergency bailout tank for air. Approaching another series of tight spots, he pulled himself through with all his strength, but got stuck for the third time. And this time, Mike was nowhere in sight. Meanwhile, Mike had climbed a little and found a hole leading back to the guideline. Believing that Shane had gone ahead, he followed the line upward toward the next restriction. Feeling tension on the line, he assumed that Shane was pulling from the front. At the next tie-off, however, Mike realized that Shane was actually behind him, still attached to an earlier part of the guideline. Fearing the worst for Shane, Mike backtracked through the tight passages and boulders. But soon, the line stopped moving, a sign that Shane was in serious trouble. Pressing on, Mike discovered Shane wedged tightly in a narrow opening, lifeless, and no longer wearing his rebreather mouthpiece. His bailout tank was empty, his suit was torn, and the cord to his dive computer was ripped away. It was clear that Shane had fought hard to free himself, but had not survived. Mike tried to free Shane, but soon realized he had to start to get out and report the tragedy to the rest of the team. He returned the next day to recover Shane's body, having navigated those tight, maze-like passages through the boulder field all by himself. Waianapanapa Caves. On January 29, 2017, 32-year-old Gregory Wilhelm was vacationing in Maui, Hawaii with 3 friends when a fun day at Waianapanapa State Park turned into a nightmare. While visiting the park, the group discovered the entrance to the Waianapanapa Caves. The 4 of them, 2 men and 2 women, decided to take a swim in the well-lit pool near the cave entrance, just as many tourists had done before. While the women stayed by the pool, Gregory, eager to explore, convinced his male friends to join him inside the cave. Gregory decided to improvise and used his phone as a flashlight. He put it inside a Ziploc bag to avoid it getting wet. If they had been planning to do cave exploration to begin with, they probably would have brought a proper flashlight. The women decided to wait at the swimming pool at the cave entrance. Gregory and 1 friend ventured into the darkness. After only a few feet, they reached an area where the water rose to their waists and encountered a boulder blocking the way. Beneath the boulder was a deep pool, a popular spot for divers, but without proper equipment, they agreed to do just a quick dive of about a minute before resurfacing. Since Gregory was the only one with a working light, his friend followed him underwater. Soon, they discovered that the depth was much greater than expected. Curiosity drove Gregory to explore further into a narrow passage, but as the water level began to rise, his friend grew scared and swam back to the surface in total darkness without telling Gregory, leaving him behind. Eventually, though, Gregory needed air and tried to turn back, only to find himself surrounded by darkness. Panicked, he searched for an exit and managed to find a small pocket of air, but he soon realized how unpredictable the cave was. The water level shifted dramatically with time, and strong currents and violent waves were common. Forced to make a split-second decision before running out of air, he pressed on further into the cave. Meanwhile, Gregory's friend miraculously resurfaced at the spot where they had originally dived, but there was no sign of Gregory. Worried, the 2 women decided to enter the cave, and inside, they found Gregory's friend in a state of panic and disorientation. Realizing that Gregory's life was in danger, his male friend re-entered the cave in total darkness. He instructed both of the women to scream so he could use the sound as a guide to help him find his way back. After making a 3rd dive, he spotted a tiny light in the distance that grew brighter as he approached. It turned out to be the flashlight on Gregory's phone. However, when he picked it up, Gregory was nowhere to be seen. He returned to his friends, and together they rushed out of the cave to call the Hana Fire Department, which immediately contacted rescue crews. Later, reports indicated that Gregory had lost his sense of direction in a very tight passage. Each failed attempt to retrace his steps only made him more panicked. Eventually, he took a wrong turn, and by the time he tried to find his way back, it was too late. He drowned in total darkness. When rescuers finally arrived, they found Gregory's body 75 feet deep in the cave. The Goss Canyon Tragedy. On September 17, 2000, brothers Michael and Paul Hayden decided to explore an abandoned well cave in Goss Canyon in La Crescenta Montrose, California, a cave they had known well from childhood visits with their 4 other siblings. This particular cave featured dry ledges and holes, as well as a water pool approximately 100 feet deep, situated between water shafts above. They entered the cave through a small 3-by-4-foot entrance that led to a horizontal passage about 50 feet long. Paul, a master sergeant and elite scuba diver with the Air Force Pararescue Force, took the lead. He was equipped with scuba gear that provided him with 2 hours of air and had a GoPro strapped to his head to serve as a light. Meanwhile, Michael stayed near the pool area to monitor his brother. They used a rope tether system attached to a large boulder in the main cave. Michael would tug the rope to check on Paul's status, and Paul would respond with similar tugs to indicate he was okay. For the first 20 minutes, their communication system worked flawlessly. Then, when Michael pulled the rope twice, expecting a response, he received none. Pulling again, he found the rope was tight and immobile. Initially thinking Paul was stuck, Michael pulled as hard as he could. When nothing changed, he immediately left the cave to seek help from the local fire department, knowing that Paul had only 90 minutes of air remaining. Fortunately, the local fire department responded immediately, along with the LA Sheriff's Office and the LA Fire Department, and quickly traveled to the cave entrance to begin the rescue. When Paul's GoPro was found, its footage was analyzed, and it revealed the exact moment he removed his regulator to breathe air from an air pocket in an abandoned water shaft. The air in these pockets, whether formed in abandoned water shafts or naturally within the cave, did not circulate and was contaminated by decay gases from the surrounding soil, rock, and organic material, as well as by gases released through water erosion of stones. This leads to a dangerous increase in carbon dioxide concentration. Although Paul was a scuba diver, he was not a certified cave diver. He knew the risks of air pockets in caves and usually carried a lighter to test the oxygen levels before removing his regulator. However, on that tragic day, he didn't have his lighter and assumed the air was safe for a short breath. The footage also showed the walls of the shaft and then captured Paul's submersion in water as he made no attempt to replace his regulator. He lost consciousness instantly, becoming incapacitated and inadvertently poisoning himself with CO2, dying within a minute or two as he sank to the bottom. Culverson Creek Tragedy. At around 3:45 p.m. on November 28, 1985, 7 cavers entered the Fuller's entrance of Culverson Creek Cave, a 20.8-mile-long system in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. The group had originally planned to explore Friar's Hole, but high water levels because of heavy rain forced them to switch to a cave less prone to flooding. None of the cavers had been in Fuller's before. The entrance passage was a canyon between 5 and 8 feet wide, with a 6 to 12-inch deep stream flowing swiftly over small, loose rock slabs. About 50 feet inside, on a downhill slope, a boulder stood in the center of the passage, with the stream flowing by on the left. At 3:50 p.m., 3 cavers passed the boulder, while 3 more were in the process, with 26-year-old Eric Sinkhole leading. As Sinkhole reached the center of the boulder, it suddenly tilted to the left. Despite the cavers' attempts to stop it, the rock moved, pinning Sinkhole by his head in a standing position. 1 caver immediately left to get help, while 4 others attempted in vain to move the boulder. Then, 1 caver supported Sinkhole from below, as 3 companions searched the entrance cave for something to use as a lever. They tried with old truck parts, but they proved ineffective. 1 caver was sent to fetch a hydraulic auto jack, and another called the Eastern Region Cave Rescue Network at 4:10 p.m. Sinkhole lost consciousness within 30 seconds of the rockfall and stopped moving after about 1 minute. At 3:59 p.m., John Evans, a member of the group, noted that Sinkhole's pulse was still strong despite his unconscious state and a trickle of blood from his left nostril. Around 4:20 p.m., the hydraulic jack arrived on the scene. With its help, along with some crowbars, the team was finally able to shift the boulder. Sinkhole was carefully moved to a dry spot about 20 feet away, and CPR was initiated immediately. The Rennick Rescue Squad soon arrived, and a paramedic took over CPR at 4:29 p.m. Sinkhole was evacuated on a stretcher and reached a hospital by ambulance. Despite establishing IVs and administering cardiac drugs, his condition did not improve, and he was pronounced dead at 6:05 p.m. If you liked this video, subscribe for similar ones or join my Discord to suggest another.